Big guns, big action, and even bigger explosions. No decade did it better than the 1980s. From belt-fed machine guns laying waste to entire platoons, to compact submachine guns that turned crime dramas into bullet-riddled war zones, the weapons of this era became just as legendary as the actors who wielded them. But which ones were most iconic? Which ones ruled the silver screen and captured the imaginations of gun enthusiasts everywhere? In this video, we'll talk about 10 of the most famous weapons of the 80s. The ones that tore through bad guys, saved heroes from impossible odds, and became instant classics. Stick around as we break down the history, real-world impact, and cinematic dominance of these legendary weapons. Ithaca 37. The Ithaca 37 has roots stretching back to 1937, yet it stayed relevant well into the 1980s. Based on a John Browning concept, it ejects and loads from the bottom, making life easier for left-handed shooters who got tired of shell casings flying past their faces. Chamberings ranged from 12 gauge to smaller bores, and it came with a standard or extended magazine tube, depending on who was carrying it. The sturdy steel construction and smooth pump made it a favorite for military, police, and the occasional bank guard. By the time the 80s rolled around, you could spot the Ithaca 37 in flicks like The Terminator from 1984, where it lent unstoppable toughness to the screen. Directors often used the riot or stakeout models for close quarters sequences since the short barrel added intensity to any standoff. It also appeared in RoboCop from 1987 and Near Dark from the same year, keeping up the tradition of big blasts in an era of gritty firefights. Did you know that during Vietnam, Navy SEALs requested special pistol grips and magazine extensions from the Naval Air Weapons Station at China Lake? That design ended up influencing Ithaca's own factory add-ons. Even after all of these years, the Ithaca 37 remains an icon of reliability, especially for fans who admire its strong connection to 1980s on-screen heroics. M60. Now, we've all seen the M60 unleashing chaos in classic 1980s blockbusters, feeding belts of 7.62 by 51mm NATO and built for everything from squad support to vehicle mounts. Early adopters discovered that it could be temperamental in harsh environments, yet it became America's workhorse in Vietnam. This was a gas-operated, air-cooled design meant to succeed older Browning models, so it carried the burden of delivering sustained fire at a more manageable rate than the infamous MG42. By the 1980s, the M60 had cemented its place on screen. You might recall seeing it in First Blood from 1982, where Sylvester Stallone's John Rambo blasted through an entire small town, and in Commando from 1985, letting Arnold Schwarzenegger tear through enemy lines. It also popped up in Missing in Action from 1984 with Chuck Norris, and Platoon from 1986, underscoring the rifle's raw firepower. Now, some sets used older M60s that had worn parts, but armorers made sure that they could still spit blanks without jamming. Real troops appreciated how it put serious lead down range, though lugging it around on foot was no picnic. Still, that belt-fed thunder had a way of capturing imaginations, and once you saw it lighting up the jungle or punishing waves of bad guys, you knew you were witnessing pure 80s action. SPAS 12. Franchi's SPAS 12 hit the market in 1979, so it spent its younger days establishing its reputation as a futuristic shotgun back in the 80s. You could swap between pump action and semi-auto modes, making it versatile for different shell types. It looked hefty and intimidating, and that folding stock with the optional hook made it seem like it walked straight out of a sci-fi flick. Though it weighed more than other shotguns, it drew attention from police units and special forces in limited roles. Hollywood seized on the SPAS 12's dramatic style, throwing it into 80s hits like The Terminator and RoboCop. Sometimes the actors struggled with semi-auto blanks, so pump mode was used more often than you'd think. Now, here's a fun one. Did you know that producers had to rely on custom blank setups just to keep the scenes running smoothly? There were times a prop version stood in just to avoid constant jams. Chambered in 12 gauge, it offered intimidation in spades, even if real-world adoption wasn't as widespread as you'd guess from the films. That dual mode feature stands out to folks who appreciate quirky engineering. If you ever see a SPAS 12 in person, you'll recognize its imposing silhouette from countless 80s action sequences that showcased its cinematic presence more than any real tactical advantage. Now we're going to take a second to remind you to like, subscribe, and to share the hell out of this video. Your views, likes, and subscriptions are the reason our team can keep bringing you human-created content for the weapon enthusiast, homesteader, prepper, and also just to the everyday guy looking to get a little more prepared. Listen, without you, we couldn't do what we do. So to those of you who have already subbed, and to those of you who are about to do just that, thank you. MAC-10. Officially called the Ingram Model 10, the MAC-10 first emerged in the 1960s, but truly found its pop culture stride in the 80s. Firing either 45 ACP or 9x19mm at a breakneck rate from an open bolt, this compact submachine gun became a staple for villains and mercenaries on film. It was simple, boxy, and easy to hide under a coat, perfect for gritty street shootouts. Movies like Scarface from 1983 made the MAC-10 a household name, and it turned up again in Commando from 1985. Giving bad guys a menacing bullet hose. Did you know that on some sets, armorers used semi-automatic clones converted to blank fire because the real MAC-10 could be unpredictable, to say the least, in untrained hands? Even when suppressors were attached, it offered slightly more control, but that muzzle climb was still intense. In real life, it found its way into the hands of certain special ops units, though it never fully replaced bigger submachine guns. You could say that the MAC-10's big heyday arrived on the big screen, where that rattling burst of ammo told audiences to brace themselves. No 80s gangster flick felt complete without at least one shootout featuring this compact powerhouse. Colt M1911. The M1911 served soldiers going back to World War I, yet it thrived in 1980s cinema as a timeless 45 ACP sidearm. John Browning's design has proven itself many times over, so you might still even find it on duty with special forces or certain law enforcement units. Its single-stack magazine and crisp trigger appealed to enthusiasts who valued precision and power in a slim package. Now, on-screen, the M1911 popped up in Scarface and Full Metal Jacket from 1987, plus a slew of cop dramas. Some directors even insisted on the M1911 because they preferred the classic profile. Did you know that many older surplus guns were used for blank conversions? And this actually led to some occasional feeding problems. Armorers typically overcame these by polishing feed ramps or tinkering with springs. Collectors still love the myriad of variants, from commander length styles to custom finishes with engraved slides. But in the 80s, you'd see it everywhere from vigilante justice stories to gritty war epics. Its 45 ACP punch was well suited to Hollywood's love for over-the-top stopping power, ensuring that the M1911 stayed iconic even as newer pistols emerged. HK PSG-1. The HK PSG-1 emerged after 1972's Munich tragedy, but by the 1980s, it was known as one of the most accurate semi-auto sniper rifles around. Derived from the roller-delayed blowback G3, it was chambered in 7.62 by 51mm NATO and boasted sub-MOA precision in a reliable self-loading package. Law enforcement units that could afford it jumped at the chance for a high-end marksman rifle with a fancy scope and fully adjustable stock. Movie buffs from the 80s might recall glimpses of the PSG-1 in more specialized roles, typically in titles where elite snipers or assassins needed a cutting-edge rifle. You'd see references in films like Die Hard. Some sets even faked the PSG-1 look by dressing up an HK-94 with a big scope and a custom forehand, just to, keep costs down. The thing is, PSG-1 purists could usually spot the difference, but normies rarely noticed. This rifle was so pricey that average shooters rarely laid hands on it. That exclusivity, combined with the mystique of ultra-precise German engineering, made the PSG-1 a coveted star whenever it appeared. If you were around in the 80s and saw a sleek black rifle in a sniper scene, odds are they were aiming for the PSG-1 vibe. Ruger Mini 14. Ruger introduced the Mini 14 back in 1973, but it really became a familiar sight on 80s screens. Chambered mostly in 223 Remington or 5.56 by 45mm NATO, it used a scaled-down Garand-style action that offered decent reliability at a reasonable price. The ranch rifle version even had built-in scope mounts, while the GB model included bayonet lugs and flash suppressors for law enforcement. In the 1980s, you might have spotted it in Red Dawn from 1984, or television shows like The A-Team, which gave the Mini 14 a paramilitary flair. Did you know that some sets use stainless versions to stand out in bright outdoor scenes? Others fitted them with folding stocks and extended magazines for that action-packed final act. Now, real law enforcement agencies sometimes chose the Mini 14 over the AR-15 to sidestep controversies surrounding military-style rifles. Accuracy wasn't always on par with competition-grade firearms, but the Mini 14 did well for plinking, ranch duty, and screen presence. If you had one in the 80s, you probably appreciated how light and handy it felt. Combine that with the rifle's constant Hollywood appearances, and it's clear that the Mini 14 was a fixture of the decade, bridging the gap between old-school design and modern firepower. Remington 870. The Remington 870 arrived in 1950, but by the 1980s, it was practically the default pump-action shotgun for American law enforcement. Chamberings covered everything from 410 bore to 12 gauge, and you could grab configurations ranging from 18-inch riot setups to longer hunting barrels. That adaptability made it a star among cops, duck hunters, and home defenders alike. If you think back to 80s movies, you'll catch the 870 in Aliens from 1986, though that version was heavily dressed up, or in countless cop flicks where officers racked a shell dramatically. Lethal Weapon from 1987 also gave glimpses of Remington's mainstay. Here's a pretty cool fact. Did you know that film crews would often use the basic Wingmaster model but swap out the furniture for a more tactical look? Owners loved how reliably it cycled, even with varied ammo, and how easy it was to find accessories like extended tubes and folding stocks. For a decade filled with crime dramas, the 870 fit right in. One pump was all it took to announce serious intentions. Long after the 80s concluded, the 870 kept proving itself in the field. Yet its cinematic legacy from that era remains a big reason people recognize it at first glance. RPG-2. The RPG-2 may have dated back to 1949, but it showed up in certain 80s war films that needed a stand-in for older guerrilla firepower. This Soviet-designed rocket launcher preceded the famous RPG-7, sporting a simple tube that fired a shape-charged warhead against light armor. Communist allies around the globe licensed it, such as the Type 56 in China and the B-40 in Vietnam, making it widespread in Cold War conflicts. In the 1980s, you could spot it in movies focusing on Southeast Asia or Cold War hotspots like Platoon from 1986, or anything depicting leftover weaponry from earlier decades. Some directors would occasionally substitute in the RPG-2 to portray less advanced factions, while keeping the RPG-7 for more formidable threats. Real fighters appreciated its lightweight and basic mechanics, though its effective range was limited. Despite the newer RPG-7 dominating the headlines, the RPG-2 lingered on, especially wherever insurgent groups used older stockpiles. That longevity, along with cameo roles in 80s cinema, preserved its image as a scrappy, inexpensive launcher that changed the face of asymmetrical warfare. Steyr AUG. Steyr's AUG arrived in 1977, yet by the 1980s, it had become the poster child for a futuristic assault rifle. Chambered in 5.56 by 45mm NATO, it used a bullpup design to keep the overall length short without sacrificing barrel length. Throw in a built-in scope and polymer construction, and you have a rifle that looks straight out of tomorrow. Military units in Austria and Australia adopted it, drawn by the quick-change barrel feature and reliability. That same sci-fi vibe made the AUG a frequent star in 80s action. You might remember it from Commando from 1985, where it gave the baddies a high-tech edge, or in Die Hard, brandished by slick terrorists who wanted the coolest gear. Did you know that some production teams used semi-automatic AUGs fitted with blank firing adapters? They also occasionally replaced the integrated optic with a rail if the scope was hard to adapt for filming. Even after the 1980s ended, the AUG remained a significant presence in the firearms world. It was modular, comfortable for most shooters, and had an unmistakable silhouette. Fans of that era still connect it to the big-haired, explosive-laden extravaganzas on screen, solidifying its place as one of the most memorable rifles that combines style with forward-thinking design. And that's a wrap. The 1980s gave us some of the most iconic guns in history, but which one caught your attention the most? Make sure to drop a comment down below and let us know. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a deep dive into the world of legendary firearms. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video. And as always, this is Threat to Survival. Prepare today. Thrive tomorrow. Embrace the threat to survival.